This is Alex, and this is my slightly late August wrap-up. The first book I'm going to start with is Carry On Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse. Carry On Jeeves is a collection of short stories which focuses on the characters of Jeeves and Worcester. Jeeves being the highly competent butler and essentially babysitter of Worcester, who is a well-off bachelor who doesn't really do anything apart from getting into trouble that Jeeves inevitably gets him out of. It was brought into modern times with the adaptation by Hugh Laurie and Stephen Fry. Stephen Fry playing Jeeves and Hugh Laurie playing Worcester. I think that was done, though, maybe about 20 years ago. So I don't think a lot of people still know about the two characters, but I really do recommend this as a piece of period fiction from English society in about the first few decades of the 20th century. So from that aspect, it's very interesting and quite a funny depiction of that society, and I think it's some of the best dialogue and the best descriptions that you will read in the book. P.G. Wodehouse was a master of putting seemingly unrelated words together and making the most vivid descriptions, and yeah, it's really a treat just to read it on that basis. There are a lot of collections of P.G. Wodehouse stories and of Jeeves and Worcester, but I would say that Carry On Jeeves is a good place to start. I think it's some of the best stories. They're quite short, very easy to read. So I think if you're interested in English society around that time, or if you're interested in comedic fiction, I would definitely say that this is something to give a go. Or watch the series. I'm sure you can find that somewhere as well. And there are definitely clips on YouTube. The next set of books are on English history, and it is these three books. So the first, Great Britain and Empire by James A. Williamson, Spirit of English History, A.L. Rowse, and History of England by G.M. Trevelyan. Now, these are quite, not boring. Well, they're a little boring. I don't think, unless you're interested desperately in English history, I wouldn't necessarily recommend reading these books. The problem is when you have an overview of history, and this is literally the history of England, from, pre-Roman invasion, so talking 55 BC, before that up till now. And yeah, it shows, there are some periods which are really interesting, but that's what, 50 pages, 60 pages within the whole book, and then the rest of it, you're reading things which you might not necessarily care about. So for me, it was something that I wanted to read about. It was something that I was interested in, and that was great. That made it an enjoyable read. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend these to anyone, and unless they were interested in English history, as I said. And I don't think I really recommend history overviews, especially ones from quite a few years ago. So all three of these books were written around the Second World War, which gives them interesting historical context, but in terms of how readable they are, in terms of perhaps how relevant they are to modern times, I question that a little bit. But that's not to say that overviews aren't useful. I think A Short History of England by Simon Jenkins is a really good contemporary overview of English history, but it's also a series of books, A Short History of, that give good short overviews, and then you can pick out, okay, what do I find interesting, and then get books specific to that, as opposed to going for a, not outdated, but dated history of whatever you're interested in. Personally, I also find social histories are a lot more interesting than economic histories or just general histories. I say that because they focus on the day-to-day, what people actually did, how people lived, the jobs they would do, what they'd do in their spare time, what they'd eat, how they'd dress, and things of that nature. And personally, I find that a lot more relatable and a lot more relevant to my own life, and because of that, I find it more interesting. So if you are going down the historical route, you want to learn about something, a period, then I would definitely recommend social history. Jumping back to fiction, but staying on the English theme, we have two books about Biggles by Captain W.E. Johns. I don't expect anyone watching this to know who Biggles is. It's a very, very niche collection of books and character. But he is an ace pilot, and his stories take place around the First World War, the Second World War, and the aftermath. So Biggles of the Camel Squadron is a collection of short stories set around World War I, and Biggles in Blue is set in the aftermath of World War II, and it is a standalone novel. They're children's stories. Well, I'd say they're stories for young teens, and I think that shows in terms of the stories are very straightforward, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, Hemingway's a very straightforward writer, a very blunt writer, and here's some of the best prose and the best story writing that you'll find among any authors. So I don't think it detracts in that way, but the stories themselves just aren't very complicated, and it's very repetitive. You know, there's a crisis, Biggles steps in, saves the day, they saved, on to the next adventure. And, you know, that's fine, but like the first one. But then when you've got, you know, 7 or 8 of these stories, and they all follow a very similar pattern, yeah, I want a bit more when I'm reading a book. And especially from a short story collection, I think there needs to be more diversity within the stories that you're telling, how the plots play out, and things of that nature. I don't think they're bad books. They're fine. I think for what they are, you know, it's fine. It's all good, but not the most thrilling books I've read, not something that I'm going to be going back to. And to be honest, I only read them because I had them physically on my bookshelf, and I just have been recently working to try and get through all of my physical TBR before I buy new books, which I failed to do because I bought new books recently and I've still got a physical TBR. But yeah, we're working on it. We're getting through it. The final 3 books are all philosophy, and they are all by Friedrich Nietzsche. They are on the genealogy of morals, the joyous science, and human to human. I know it says Beyond Good and Evil as well, but I have that in another copy, which I'd read previously, so it was only human to human from that book. Now, Nietzsche is an interesting character. He certainly has a way with words and a way of putting his ideas across. Perhaps not in the most amicable of ways, in the most soft way that everyone's is, but within what he writes, within his ideas, I think there are some really important things that everyone can take away and everyone can learn from, particularly on individualism, on constantly trying to better yourself and to constantly make sure that you are improving and only focusing on yourself in that pursuit of betterment. There is a lot of sifting that needs to take place to get to these ideas. And one of the questions I have when I'm reading Nietzsche is, did he ever edit his work or discard something that he wrote down? What I mean by that is that Nietzsche wrote all of his books, or at least all the ones I've read, in maxims. So you'll have these short bits of text which are centered around a singular idea or a collection of ideas, interspersed with longer sections of text, which maybe go for 2 or 3 pages, but rarely longer than that. And again, they will focus on one idea. Then the books are split into sections where they are focusing on an individual idea in a collection of maxims of these short ideas. Sometimes he'll just do miscellaneous as a whole section of the book, and that's just where he dumps everything that didn't fit in other places. So on the one hand, it's kind of nice because it's quite easy to read. You can read to the one maxim and then, you know, drop it. There's no 50-page commitment when you're reading in each book. It can literally be 5 minutes a day and you're good, which is nice. But then there can sometimes be a slight incoherency within the book, and you're really jumping around from one idea to the next, which can be slightly confusing, I think, especially for a newer reader who's never encountered Nietzsche before, which is a shame because I think Nietzsche is someone that everyone should read. You know, agree, disagree, probably a lot of both within any of his books, covering any of his ideas, because he was very forceful with his language. He would really exaggerate and push everything to their absolute limits, which is very interesting from a thought experiment perspective, as you're engaging with these ideas that are pushing you to the limit of what is morality, what is the role of an individual in society. Is it better to be an individual or to be immersed within the crowd, within the group? I think it's well worth the readers. There are a lot of interesting ideas, especially because he was writing at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century. In the 19th century, coming off the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, and then leading into the 20th century where we've got the two world wars, this was a period of real change in Europe, and Nietzsche was writing right in the middle of it. So it was very interesting to see how those events in the 19th century shaped how he was writing, even though he didn't necessarily live through them. But also how his ideas and predictions then manifested themselves in the 20th century, which, I mean, personally, I think that's what defines a good philosopher. It's not necessarily whether you agree or disagree with their ideas, because that's totally subjective. It completely comes down to the individual. But if they can accurately predict what is going to happen and make these calls, then, I don't know, something's got to be said for that, no matter what you think of the person. Having said that I really think that you should read Nietzsche. I think On the Genealogy of Morals is the best place to start. As you might expect, it focuses heavily on morality, but also on individualism and knowledge seeking, which are Nietzsche's main ideas, and you'll find them coming up again and again in the books that he writes about. As the ideas are consistent everywhere, I'd recommend On the Genealogy of Morals, as I think it's the most coherent book. It's quite short, coming at around only 140 pages, which I think is good compared to something like All Too Human, which is over twice as long, as Nietzsche's ideas can be very dense and quite hard to get through. So starting off with a fairly short book is a good introduction to it. As it primarily focuses on Nietzsche's main recurring ideas, it also is a good primer if you want to read more of his works and look more into that, as you will have a basis of the ideas from On the Genealogy of Morals, and then you can have an easier time understanding his future works, where he draws in more random and different ideas, especially like All Too Human, which covers everything from love, which I did not expect to find Nietzsche talking about, to also how to be a good author, how to be a good novelist. It's slightly random in Human, All Too Human, so I definitely think that starting anywhere on the Genealogy of Morals is a great place to start. It's also one of his most popular books. Beyond Good and Evil is too, and I think most people would recommend starting there just because it is so popular, but personally, I found On the Genealogy of Morals a lot more straightforward and easier to understand. And having read Beyond Good and Evil first, and then On the Genealogy of Morals, going back to Beyond Good and Evil, I found it a lot easier to understand, in part thanks to reading On the Genealogy of Morals. It just made everything make much more sense in regards to Nietzsche. So yeah, those are the 10 books that I read in August, about, doing this 2 weeks in September, but hey, it still counts. And I know this is quite heavy on Nietzsche and non-fiction, which is just where I was going with this. To be honest, I really want to get back into reading fiction, and I plan to in September, or at the moment, although sadly that hasn't transpired yet, in the first half of September, but we will see how the rest of the month plays out. Yeah, if you've got any questions about it, want to know any of the books, they're linked in the description below. And yeah, that was my August. See ya.